We have so welcome back everyone from the afternoon tea or morning tea, wherever you are. So this is the last session for today, and it's my great honor to introduce Professor Jonathan Webster, a leading figure in systemic functional linguistics and longtime head of the Department of Chinese Translation and Linguistics at City University of Hong Kong. He has edited the collected works of Michael Halliday, Ruqaiya Hassan, Sidney Lam, and Bragg Cuttrell, and co-authored Text Linguistics, The How and Why of Meaning with Halliday, authored Understanding Verbal Art, a Functional Linguistic Approach, and serves as founding editor of Linguistics and the Human Sciences, LHS, and managing editor of Word. Today, in Halliday's centenary year, he revisits the seminal 1961 paper, Categories of the Theory of Grammar, and traces how it seeded an evolving theory of language. So the title of Jonathan's talk is Halliday's Categories, Paper in Work, Origin of an Evolving Theory of Language. So please welcome Professor Jonathan Webster. Jonathan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. And greetings to everyone there. And looking forward to talking to you today about this very special paper that appeared in Word. I'm going to begin by, just a minute, by saying a bit about Word itself. It is the journal of the International Linguistics Association. It's began publishing in 1945, so it is officially this year 80 years old. It began with those that were the founders of the Linguistic Circle of New York, like Roman Jakobson, Morris Swadesh, Andre Martinet, and Henry Lee Smith. Very notable, published in Word, is Ferguson's Diglossia, in 1959, William Leboeuf's first journal paper, The Social Motivation of a Sound Change, 1963, and the paper that we're going to be discussing today, Halliday's first journal paper, Categories of the Theory of Grammar. Categories of the Theory of Language is the title, and it appears in the first volume of Halliday's collected works on grammar. Categories was Halliday's first journal article, as I mentioned, following the completion of his doctoral dissertation 6 years earlier. The article is dedicated to his mentor, J.R. Firth. In fact, Halliday had hoped to share the article with Firth for feedback before he submitted it to Word. He brought the manuscript to a conference where Firth was scheduled to deliver the opening address. However, as everyone gathered in anticipation of Firth's address, they received the shocking news that Firth had passed away in his sleep the night before. Now, Halliday writes this about his purpose in writing this paper. It is, he says, to suggest what seemed to me to be the fundamental categories of that part of general linguistic theory which is concerned with how language works at the level of grammar, with brief reference to the relations between grammar and lexis and between grammar and phonology. Looking back then on this chapter 40 years later, Halliday explains his rationale for assigning things to categories. He says this: struggling with the grammar of Chinese and then of English in the conceptual categorical frameworks which were then available, traditional grammar, linguist descriptions of languages, Jespersen, Wong Lee, Firth's system structure theory, Pike, Fries, Hill, Hockett, etc. He continues, I was constantly finding that the categories were unclear. You would find a label attached to some patch or other, but with no indication of what kind of category it was supposed to be. and the whole battery of technical statements never added up to a coherent picture of the whole. I felt, he says, I needed to know where I was at any moment and where any descriptive statement that I made fitted into the overall account. Well, that last sentence, I felt I needed to know where I was at any moment and where any descriptive statement that I made fitted into the overall account. It prompts the question, I think, for each of us. Where do we locate ourselves in the overall account of all that is language? So keeping that in mind as we proceed, let's talk first about what were the categories that Halliday identified. Units, sentence, clause, word, morpheme, structure, the ordered repetition of like events that make up those patterns, basically the syntagmatic relations. Class, the grouping of like events by their occurrence in patterns, for example, the class of nominals. And system, the occurrence of one rather than another among a number of like events, the set of options, the paradigmatic relations. These relate to one another along three distinct scales of abstraction: rank, the hierarchical ordering, exponence, what we would maybe talk about as realization, delicacy, depth of detail. This was basically what Halliday was outlining was the scale and category grammar, this approach. Now, Jim Martin, also writing in Word, a paper entitled Meaning Matters, A Short History of Systemic Functional Linguistics, he writes this: Halliday's 1961 article, Categories of the Theory of Grammar, published in Word, is generally landmarked as the founding paper for what evolved as systemic functional linguistics, hereafter SFL. Now, going back again to the paper, Halliday talks about levels. There is substance, phonic or graphic, phonology, orthography, which he describes as an interlevel relating substance to form, form including grammar and lexis, and context, like phonology, as an interlevel relating form to extra-textual features. Notice something is missing here, though. And what seems to be missing, I think, is what he later includes in an article in 1964, and that is what? Semantics. Christian writes this about, again, with respect to this particular paper of Halliday's. In the case of SFL, the approach of starting with the outlines of language and gradually filling in the details has been made possible by the relational and dimensional nature of the architecture of the theoretical model of language. The scales, rank, exponence, delicacy, the scales of scale and category theory, the first phase in the development of systemic functional theory. So let me pose the question now. How has the architecture of systemic functional linguistics evolved since this earliest beginning, as pointed out by Christian, by Jim, in Halliday's categories paper in Word? Let's begin with the architecture. And what you see on your screen is a visual mapping. And this, in fact, is from Halliday. It appears in a chapter entitled Key Terms. It is also, as Christian's paper that I just referred to, forthcoming at the beginning of next year in the Bloomsbury Handbook of Systemic Functional Linguistics. And you'll see this mapping as we go through and look at the various key terms related to SFL theory. So let's begin. The architecture of language. defined in terms of several dimensions or parameters, beginning with hierarchy, rank, and strata. The architecture of language, then, includes the hierarchy of rank: clause, phrase, group, word, morpheme, related by composition. Now, Halliday's categories article, he defines rank as a hierarchical layering of constituents. 5 years after Categories was published in Word, Halliday's proposed theoretical framework was challenged by Peter Matthews in an article published in the Journal of Linguistics. And Matthews' paper was entitled "The Concept of Rank in Neo-Firthian Grammar." Halliday's reply to Matthews was published in the same journal issue as Matthews' paper. And in that response, Halliday explains, rank is a hypothesis that is worth making, both for its descriptive advantages and for the questions that follow from it. Ranks, clause, group or phrase, word. Now, in the introduction to Volume 7, Studies in the English Language, Halliday describes how he came to see the clause. The clause as the place or the locus where fundamental choices in meaning were acted out. As he says, much of the impetus towards a scale and category grammar started from that simple observation. Halliday poses the following guiding question for his own approach to the study of language. What manner of linguistic description can show how choices in meaning are acted out in the clause? The clause has a prominent place then in his theory. Beginning at the rank of clause, he is looking at what manner of linguistic description can show how choices in meaning are acted out. Now, Halliday's notes, the paper, Notes on Transitivity and Theme in English, it was a paper that was published, in fact, in 3 parts over 3 consecutive issues of the Journal of Linguistics. It's also appears in Volume 7, Studies in the English Language. This paper marked a shift in orientation. The shift away from prioritizing structure to exploring how systems of meaningful choices such as transitivity, theme, are lexicogrammatically realized in the clause. Again, going back to this graphic from Halliday's Introduction to Functional Grammar, and looking at the clause, the point that is being made is that choices in meaning from the systems of transitivity, process, participant, circumstance, and theme and reme, are realized as low-level grammatical functions corresponding to structural elements within the clause. Take it the next step, the hierarchy of strata. Context, semantics, lexicogrammar. These are related by realization and instantiation, as we will see later. So from the 80s, Halliday adopted this stratified model, with semantics distinguished from lexicogrammar. Semantics then being the meaning-making potential of text, the lexicogrammar being meaning-making potential of clauses. It wasn't really until the 90s that we begin to see context added as a stratum. And that really came from Halliday's venture into linguistic computing. It appeared in a paper in 1995, was a plenary at Packling 95, Computing Meanings, Some Reflections on Past Experience and Recent Prospects. Now, semantics there as the interface between lexicogrammar and context. Now, Halliday's notion of context and its place in a theory of grammar, that was very much influenced by the work of Malinowski and Firth. Malinowski, an anthropologist, he used linguistics to support his ethnographic research. He distinguished between context of culture as potential and context of situation as actual. But it was J.R. Firth, Malinowski's younger colleague, Halliday's mentor, who, as Halliday says, saw the possibility of integrating this notion of the situation as a kind of context into a general theory of language. In an interview with Jim Martin and Paul Thibault, Halliday says this. He says, can we actually model and represent and interpret context within the framework of what is generally involved as a theory of language? Firth thought you could. And I, Halliday speaking, I think so too, if only because it's the best chance you've got. Halliday reinterpreted Malinowski Firth's concept of context of situation in terms of the three dimensions: field, tenor, and mode. Field, what is being talked about. Tenor, and Halliday didn't use that term until 1974. In fact, before that, like in the article in 1964, he talked about style. But because of some complications due to the fact that style is talked about in stylistics, he changed the term to tenor. Who is talking to whom? Mode. How is the activity taking place? Context. Understood in terms of field, tenor, and mode, activates the choices of meaning, which are then realized by wording. So there is this relationship of realization. Text as instance, what people mean. Parole is realized in context of situation. Language as system, potential, what people can mean, is realized in society. Jim Martin and Christian Matheson, back in 1991, already were beginning to portray context as having a realizational connection spanning semantics, lexicogrammar, phonology. The construal of context in terms of field, tenor, mode activates the speaker's choice of meanings. These meanings, meaningful choices, are realized in acts of meaning. And these acts of meaning contribute then to how others also construe the context. Ruqaiya Hassan writes this. She says, nothing enters the system of language, the langue, except through the working of parole in meeting the realizational demands in the construal of meanings relevant to some context of situation. And what happens in parole is relevant to the evolution of the resources of the language system. The system of language evolves because of what happens in parole as realized in context of situation. Ruqaiya Hassan's influence on Halliday's approach and to how the theory evolved, he himself says this. She, meaning Ruqaiya Hassan, contributed substantially to the core levels of grammar and semantics and to sociolinguistics as well. She has always had this sort of perspective where she has been able to work on the inside of language, but to look at it from roundabout. And I, Halliday speaking, have certainly learned a great deal from her. Ruqaiya Hassan, the paper that she was working on when she passed away, dealt with tenor, modeling tenor, interactant relations. The title of the paper later appeared in Language, Context, and Text as Tenor, Rethinking Interactant Relations. And in that paper, she says this: we are acculturated into an awareness of the social relations between interactants through our having experienced acts of meaning in the living of life in society. We are acculturated into an awareness of the social relations between interactants through our having experienced acts of meaning in the living of life in society. One of the major contributions of this paper is the way in which she introduced the idea of a network. She went into detail to look at what is the basis of those interactant relations and how do they relate to how language is realized in context of situation. Hassan's network for interactant relations elaborates role relations into textual roles, social roles, agentive roles. So often we talk about field, tenor, mode, and we tend to do it in sort of, I would say, vague terms because we've never really gone into detail to see. But she has. And that is the exciting part of this paper, that is really so, it provokes our attention to the fact that we need to look at the details that are behind the choices that are being made with respect to tenor, with respect to the interactant relations, the agentive roles, how one's actions contribute to the realization of whatever social practice defines the situation. The textual roles, the speaker or addressee, social roles, attributes like sex, age, and something that she introduced, this idea of an interactive biography. Now, besides the hierarchies of rank and strata, Halliday's architecture of language also consists of clines. There is the cline of instantiation, system to instance. We talked about realization. We said parole as text is realized in context of situation. But then there is a relationship of instantiation between the text and the system. The language as system is the working of parole in meeting the realizational demands in the construal of meanings relevant to some context of situation. Again, I'm quoting from Ruqayya Hassan in an article which elaborates the idea of how what Halliday was introducing in terms of SFL relates to what we would call perhaps sociolinguistics, but what she calls it as an integrated theory for sociolinguistics. Instantiation. Halliday gives the analogy of weather and climate. Climate is something that is realized over time. We have the instances of weather, and over time, we get an idea, we develop an idea, a generalization, a theory. Climate as a theory of the weather. Now, the same idea is there with respect to language. Language as system is a theory of parole as text. The only way you can really get at what is language, this potential, is by going through and looking at how the instances of language and how over time those add up to what we then consider is that generalization, that theory of language. So we have realization, text realized in context of situation. We have language as system realized in society, and language as system is a theory of the text. We have the cline of delicacy, least delicate to most delicate. And here again, I'm going to go back to something that Ruqayya Hassan wrote, and that is the grammarian's dream, Lexis as most delicate grammar. I go to this because it begins, as you can see, this system network begins at the least delicate, the most general, and works its way through. We don't see the whole picture here, but you can see we are working toward the most delicate, which would be the choice of Lexis. Axis, the third dimension in Halliday's architecture of language. This opposition of paradigmatic and syntagmatic. I like this quote from Feng Zongxin. He writes this. He says, Halliday is cautious enough not to claim that paradigmatic relations are somehow more important than syntagmatic ones, only to emphasize that a description in terms of explicit features may help in bringing the unidimensional time sequence, the syntagmatic, the unidimensional time sequence of language into relation with its deeper patterns of organization, the paradigmatic. These paradigmatic dimensions of language are captured in the idea of systemic system of language, meaning as choice, meaning as systems of choice. Basically, a perspective that brings in the paradigmatic. And we can see it in, again, coming back to the idea of a system network. And in a system network, you see choices and choices. So we have process type, transitivity, we have mood, we have theme. A clause incorporates all three. But there are then choices that are or choices. What kind of process? Material, mental, verbal, relational. Meaning as systems of choice, paradigmatic. But then added to this is the idea of probabilistic. What if you added the probabilities of those choices? Jim Martin made this comment and Halliday responded. Jim says this idea of probabilistic system seems to be something quite critical in your theory, especially in terms of not losing sight of the way in which the text feeds back into the system. And Halliday responded, the great problem with the system is that it is very static, a very static form of representation. This system network, it's very static. It freezes the whole thing. And then he goes on, and you have to show how the actual process of making paths through the system changes the system. And how do you do that? You do that by adding the probabilities related to those choices. So then each pass through the system changes the system. Every time you talk, every time you produce a text, you are changing the system. Systems, paradigmatic, probabilistic. What about the functional aspect? Halliday was influenced by the Prague School, the idea of functionalism, but not just the Prague School functionalism. It was also his observations about how his own child developed language. Let me explain that. In 1971, Halliday was offered a chair at the University of British Columbia in Canada, and he accepted the post. He left University College London. However, the Canadian government heard about his Communist Party connection, and they denied him residency rights. He couldn't take up the job. He left one job, he could not take up the other. So then during this time, of course, there were a number of visiting scholar appointments around the world, but then in addition to that, Halliday conducted an intensive study as a participant observer of his own son's developing linguistic ability from 9 months to 2.5 years of age. Using notebook and pencil, Halliday recorded his son's utterances. The data provided a wealth of insight into how a child learns how to mean. Halliday identified the microfunctions that occur between 6 and 18 months, realized through gesture and vocal sounds. And these microfunctions, the instrumental function, language to fulfill a need, the regulatory function, language to influence the behavior of others, and so on and so forth. But then Halliday describes what he observed as, and what he calls this extraordinary semiotic leap that takes place in the child's second year. At around age 2, the child takes this extraordinary semiotic leap, generalizing the microfunctions into an opposition between two macrofunctions, the pragmatic, demanding, and the methetic, describing. So we have demanding, pragmatic, including microfunctions like regulatory, do for me, instrumental, give me. And then we have the macrofunction methetic, describing what is the interactional, you and me together, personal, I wonder about something. These occurred around 18 months to 2 years, this great semiotic leap forward. Now, what is the empirical justification, though, for saying that the microfunctions generalized into the macrofunctions? Well, he observed that they are systematically differentiated by intonation, voice quality, or some combination of the two. So, in terms of the methetic, realized by a falling intonation, the pragmatic, realized by a rising intonation. And so basically, the child's knowledge of language was stratified between the strata of semantics, pragmatic or methetic, and phonology, whether a rising tone or a falling tone. So there is this connection. So it was this stratification, the idea that the knowledge of language was stratified, that is the empirical justification for those identifying the two macro functions. Now, in the next and third stage, this opposition between the pragmatic and the methetic is further reconstrued into the metafunctions. Between 2 to 3 years, the metafunctions. Reconstruing this strategic opposition of pragmatic, methetic into this metafunctional form of organization, what we see is the pragmatic, enacting interpersonal relationships, the interpersonal. The methetic, grammar for construing experience, the experiential. And in addition, the child develops a grammar of relations, the logical, expressed through even conjunctions like and, or, and so on. Halliday acknowledges the similarities between his ideational and interpersonal metafunctions and the functions identified by Malinowski and Buehler. But he says this, I needed to add a third function, namely the textual, which you will not find in Malinowski or Buehler or anywhere else, because it is intrinsic to language. It is the function that language has of creating text, of relating itself to the context, to the situation, and the preceding text. So, 1975, in that book, Learning How to Mean, which deals with Halliday's observations of how his child developed language, he comes to this conclusion. And we begin to see the mention of metafunctions. He writes this, functionally speaking, the grammar of the adult language comprises two major components, ideational, embodying the speaker's experience, interpretation of the world that is around him, inside him, and two, interpersonal, embodying his own involvement in the speech situation, his roles, excuse me. Sorry. his roles, attitudes, wishes, judgments, and the like. Uh, Excuse me, let me take a little water. These two metafunctions, together with a third, the textual function, are incorporated into the system of the adult language as distinct sets of options, each having strong internal but weak external constraints. Each set of options is realized through distinct structures that are mapped onto one another in the production of utterances. This wasn't, in fact, the first mention of metafunctions in Halliday's writing. You can go back 1 year earlier, but again, it is around this time. It is based on his experience with how his child developed language, appearing in the article Language and Social Mands. It was Schools Council Program in Linguistics and English Teaching. This 1974, so we can see the influence of what is developing. The architecture of language, the organization by metafunction, the ideational, experiential, logical, the interpersonal, the textual. The metafunctions, representational, ideational, interpersonal, how we enact social relationships, textual, how the meaning materializes. Now bring that all together with the idea of the system network and the choices that are being made. They correspond to the metafunctions. Transitivity, the experiential. Mood, the interpersonal. Theme, the textual. And these metafunctions now act as the interface between what is going on outside of language and language as it is produced and uttered. In an interview, Halliday says this, explaining the inspiration behind representing the whole thing as potential and as a set of options. He says this was certainly influenced by my own gut feeling of what I call language as a resource. I like that phrase, his own gut feeling. So much of our exploration into language is going to be based sometimes on that gut feeling. In other words, language as a mode of life, if you like, which could be represented best as a huge network of options. So that kind of came together with the notion that it had to be the system rather than the structure that was given priority. This metafunctional organization of meaning, it coincides with our metaphor-making potential. The metafunctions. There is that non-linear step. Coinciding with the metafunctions is the idea of text as metaphor. Now, what does that mean? Why text as metaphor? Well, think of it like this. We tell our stories, we theorize our world, and we do so by means of the metaphor-making potential of the text. Halliday says this, every theory is a metaphor for what it is theorizing. Let me explain it this way. Halliday talks about creating text as a parallel virtual universe that is made of meaning, that has its own structure as metaphor for the structures it is imposing on the material world. The text has its own structure, its grammar, as a metaphor for the structures, the ideology that is being imposed on the material world. I like a statement that was made by Russell Mears. Recently passed away. He was the emeritus professor of psychiatry at the University of Sydney, and he wrote this, a metaphor. He likens what we are saying, our texts, to a metaphoric cinematic screen on which is portrayed a partially glimpsed personal reality. It's metaphorical. It's partially glimpsed. It's a partially glimpsed personal reality. One's ideology is a theory of experience. It is a metaphor for what it is theorizing. So what is theory? In systemic functional linguistics, the focus is on grammar. Halliday puts it this way: a grammar is a theory of experience, of everyday life. It is metaphorical. It is a resource for making meaning. He goes on, then, what we want to do with our study of grammar, grammatics, which was a term he first used in 1988 and then described much further if you're interested, on grammar and grammatics in 1996. But to the point, grammatics is a metagrammar. It's a second-order theory for explaining how the grammar constructs a theory of experience. Grammar allows us to reflect consciously on how the grammar enables one to unconsciously construe experience. I think we have to illustrate that. In an address given by Susan Rice, she was at that time, UN representative for the US. In this commencement speech, she says that so much change has transpired just in my adult lifetime. You'll see so much more in yours, but it doesn't just happen. Progress is the product of human agency. Things get better because we make them better. And then she concludes by saying, if you want change, you have to make it. If we want progress, we have to drive it. That's her ideology. Then let's take a look at the text. Let's take a look at it from the standpoint of its transitivity structure. Ask the question, what's the process type being used? Who is the initiator of the process? I break it down into this table. And I'm talking about the initiator as being in using Hassan's term, the ER role. And I broke it down into I, you, we, and then everything else, okay? And I break it down in terms of the process types: being, doing, sensing, saying. Well, what do we notice? 79% of the text is I, you, we in the ER role. And half of the text is about doing. And even if you take a look at I, you, we throughout all the various process types, 71%. Well, that goes with what she's saying. Progress is the product of human agency. Things get better because we make them better. If you want change, you have to make it. If we want progress, we have to drive it. Which her way of looking at the world is also expressed in the grammar. Take a look at a poem. It's a poem by Edwin Tumbu. Just briefly, the point that he's making in the poem is that a poem becomes more satisfactory to the poet with revision. The urge to revise is always there. It's a creative itch. So, the idea of continuing revision is then given throughout the poem. How is that done? It's done by this idea of ongoing activity, reinforced grammatically by the poet's repeated use of ing verb forms. So repeatedly, standing by the pool, taking her, waiting, pilgriming, and on and so forth. David Butt talks about mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice, taking the way that we normally use language, creating out of that a non-habitual consistency. There's a motif of ongoing activity here. There's an ongoing, besides the ongoing activity, there's simultaneity. The conjunction as is again repeatedly used throughout the poem. In other words, all of these motifs, ongoing activity, simultaneity, they are captured by the grammar. They are there in what we can see through our grammatics. But again, it is what the poet is saying. It is never done, our words don't take in all. The perfect poem is future tense. Neat incompletion must suffice. Life goes on. Grammar allows one to reflect consciously on how the grammar enables one to unconsciously construe experience. Halliday says this: what is important is that we should be able to use the same theory, method of linguistic analysis, the same grammatics, whatever kind of text or subtext we are trying to interpret, whether Tennyson or Darwin, Mother Goose or the Scientific American. And he continues, otherwise, if we simply approach each text with an ad hoc, do-it-yourself kit of private commentary, we have no way of explaining their similarities, their differences, the aesthetic and functional values that differentiate one text from another, one voice from another within the frontiers of the same text. Theory. Scientific theory involves some combination of the deductive and inductive reasoning. And if we compare with sort of the mainstream of linguistics, like what we see in Chomsky's work, generative grammar, linguists start with a set of theoretical principles about the structure of language, and then apply those principles to explain syntactic structures in various languages, more a deductive kind of reasoning. But in SFL, language is studied in context, examining how people use language in specific situations to discover what motivates those linguistic choices. Context activates the choice of certain meanings, which are then realized by our choice of wordings. And together these choices form a register. I like the story. You probably heard it before. It was mentioned by Mick O'Donnell in his biography of Halliday. Halliday talks about having walked across the meadows to the house of Gene Ewer and Jeff Ellis, two that he worked with and was collaborating with. And he said, I found the word I want. A word for what? To describe a functional variety. Where did it come from? Well, it came from his reading a paper by T.B.W. Reed, a professor of Romance philology at Oxford. He wrote this: the linguistic behavior of a given individual is by no means uniform. Placed in what appear to be linguistically identical conditions, he will on different occasions speak or write differently according to what may roughly be described as different social situations. He will use a number of distinct registers. What we begin to see is how the theory is evolving. It's evolving through what he read. It's evolving through the people in his life, like Ruqaiya Hasan. It's evolving from his experience with looking at and observing the development of language in his child. Okay, so come to this question. What is a register? And if I asked you to tick one box, which would it be? Register and context are one undifferentiated phenomena, or register refers to a language variety. This is a point of disagreement between Ruqaiya Hasan and Jim Martin. She takes issue, Professor Hasan takes issue with Martin's collapsing Halliday's concepts of register and context as one undifferentiated phenomenon. She goes on to say, no one, to my knowledge, has yet shown any reasons for thinking of register as context rather than as referring to a language variety. So we approach an integrated theory of sociolinguistics, where registers are speech types. They are varieties of language along this instantial scale between text and language as system. I like one point that David Butt mentioned, and let me put it in a way that's easier to read. The case in point with which linguistics has been concerned is register. Many linguists work from grammar to meaning, posit the infinity of the output of sentences from a finite system with expressions of astonishment at how does the child learn. But we learn by cultural context. We need to know what is appropriate to the context, the meanings that we can use to achieve the goods and services pertaining to that single, complex, interpenetrated environment. You know, Malinowski distinguished between context of culture as potential and context of situation as actual. So then, do culture and society mean the same thing? Or do we need to make a distinction between them? Talcott Parsons writes this. He says, the feature of Malinowski's use of the concept of culture, which is most striking, is its encyclopedic inclusiveness. It's everything. And he continues, but he never disentangled the concept of the social system as such in any clear way from his encyclopedic concept of culture, which would have been a necessary prerequisite of further theoretical development. Raymond Firth, no relation to J.R. Firth, a different person, an anthropologist, he regarded culture and society as indispensable tools for the analysis of social life. He writes this, the terms culture and society represent different facets or components in basic human situations. If, for instance, society is taken to be an organized set of individuals with a given way of life, culture is that way of life. If society is taken to be an aggregate of social relations, culture is the content of those relations. Halliday, in an interview with Jeff Thompson and Heloisa Collins, I'm not sure if I pronounced her name right, he said this, the context of culture is the system and the context of situation. I mean, these are a single stratum related by instantiation. It is the context of culture that is the environment for genre. That's not in dispute. And so, again, we can develop this integrated theory of sociolinguistics. And again, along this instantial scale, we have the context of culture differentiated from the social system and the variety of language corresponding to the context of culture being genre. Let me illustrate the idea of genre. Commencement speeches, you know what they are. In the US, when you graduate university, you usually get some celebrity, some well-known person to come and give a commencement speech. And Time magazine identified what they considered to be the top 10 commencement speeches. The top one was David Foster Wallace. I'll come back to that. But the second one was Steve Jobs. And Time magazine writes this, about Steve Jobs, despite his prickly reputation, this heartfelt commencement address is about as good as the genre gets. Short, smart, poignant, uplifting, discussing life, love, loss. The Apple co-founder hit all the right notes. That's what a commencement speech is. That's the genre. Short, smart, poignant, uplifting. Then we have David Foster Wallace. Time magazine says this address at Kenyon was vintage Wallace, a smart, occasionally meandering discussion of the issues that consumed him, from the banality of life to the meaning of consciousness. He writes this, David Foster Wallace said this in the speech, I know that this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy and grandly inspirational, he concluded. What it is, so far as I can see, is the truth. The capital T truth is about life before death. It's about making it to 30 or maybe 50 without wanting to shoot yourself in the head. Time magazine continues, the speech reads like the first draft of a suicide note for an author who took his own life last year at the age of 46. While it's a macabre read, there's tons that's worthwhile here. The speech crackles with wit and intelligence and offers tricks for escaping the depression to which Wallace ultimately succumbed. David Foster Wallace, he committed suicide not that long after giving this speech. He begins his speech like this.
Greetings, thanks, and congratulations to Kenyon's graduating class of 2005. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" This is a standard requirement of U.S. commencement speeches, the deployment of didactic little parable-ish stories. The story thing turns out to be one of the better, less bullshitty conventions of the genre. But if you're worried that I plan to present myself here as the wise older fish explaining what water is to you younger fish, please don't be. I am not the wise old fish.
The wise old fish. He knows very clearly what a commencement speech is like. He talks about the fact that it usually has a little parable-ish story at the beginning. But then he uses what I would call, what I think we call an SFL de-automatization. It's an anti-text. He says this, "I know this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy or grandly inspirational, the way a commencement speech is supposed to sound."
I know that this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy or grandly inspirational the way a commencement speech is supposed to sound. What it is, as far as I can see, is the capital T truth with a whole lot of rhetorical niceties stripped away. You are, of course, free to think of it whatever you wish. But please don't just dismiss it as some finger-wagging Dr. Laura sermon. None of this stuff is really about morality or religion or dogma or big fancy questions of life after death. The capital T truth is about life before death. It is about the real value of a real education, which has almost nothing to do with knowledge and everything to do with simple awareness. Awareness of what is so real and essential, so hidden in plain sight all around us all the time, that we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over, this is water. This is water. It is unimaginably hard to do this, to stay conscious and alive in the adult world day in and day out. Which means yet another grand cliche turns out to be true. Your education really is the job of a lifetime, and it commences now. I wish you way more than luck.
Mr. Wallace uses de-automatization. It is an anti-text because it goes against what are the expectations. And he does that to provoke his listeners into, again, de-automatizing themselves away from their own self-centeredness. He says this, "It's a matter of my choosing to do the work of somehow altering or getting free of my natural, hardwired default setting, which is to be deeply, literally self-centered and to see and interpret everything through this lens of self." This is the idea of an anti-text.
Please.
It is an anti-commencement speech. It is contrary to the genre. It is unlike his usual style, his own literary style. It is a metaphorical variant advocating for a counter-reality that goes against, as he puts it, the default setting, the automatic, the rat race, the constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing. Not only does Wallace advocate for an alternative counter-reality, he does so with a deliberately crafted metaphorical variant, which is the antithesis of what his audience would have been expecting. Martin and Rose, they define a contextual metaphor as the process by which one genre is deployed to represent another. And they give that example in their book on genre relations about the children's story, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, as a way to give some scientific explanation of metamorphosis. And they explain, they say contextual metaphors like grammatical metaphors operate by offering readers a literal surface reading implicating one genre, but providing in addition other genre indicators signaling the presence of a deeper genre lurking behind. Why I prefer textual metaphor and not a contextual metaphor. Usually when we discuss metaphor, it's the lower stratum that is mentioned as the descriptor. We have lexical, grammatical. We don't refer to lexical or grammatical metaphors as semantic metaphors. And just like the lexical and grammatical strata are freed from the control of semantics, a textual metaphor occurs when the text is freed from the controlling upper stratum of context. An anti-text, it is a special kind of textual metaphor. Unlike the examples cited by Martin and Rhodes, it's not a matter of deploying a particular genre, such as a recipe, as a rhetorical strategy for making an argument. What distinguishes the anti-text from other examples of metaphorical variants at the level of text is that the anti-text is antithetical to the registerial requirements for a given context. Wallace did not use some other genre where one would expect a commencement-style speech, but instead a commencement speech which was antithetical in every respect to what one would expect. So then, what is the anti-text? An anti-text advocates for a counter-social reality that opposes some established norm. It is deliberately crafted to flout our expectations for the context of situation in which it is delivered. And so to elaborate further then, we have the anti-text. It goes against what we would expect for that context of situation. And that, along the instantial scale, can develop into, yes, an anti-language used by a segment of society that can be considered anti-society. In what directions will SFL go in the future? This was a question posed to Halliday. It was asked by Zhu Yongshun and Hu Zhuanglin in their interview, and Halliday replies, but please, do you recognize? Language is one of the most complex phenomena in the universe. So don't expect a theory to make it simple. If it is simplified, it is distorted. This does not mean that every user has to explore every part of the theory. But at least you should know where you are locating yourself in the total picture. That's how I see the future. Halliday had this question. It's what motivated his own study of language. What manner of linguistic description can show how choices in meaning are acted out in the clause? He located himself in the clause. Where do you locate yourself in the total picture of what is language? The perfect theory is future tense. Neat incompletion must suffice. I'm adapting from the lines in Edwin Tumbu's poem, A Poet Reading. Life goes on. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Webster, for your very inspiring talk. So hope that everyone can find your location for yourself in the SFL theory. Okay, so the floor is open for questions, for thoughts, for opinions. Anything that you would like to say? So we have, okay, so Vin says thank you to you, Jonathan. So any other thoughts? Okay, so we've got one hand raised from Yuan. So you would like to, yeah, you can turn on your mic and perhaps speak.
Yeah, I don't know how to say, but it is a great honor for me to join this conference and to listen to all of the giants in our field. Um, yeah, this is might sound like a silly questions to you as a giants, but I am as a newbie to SFL. I really want to clarify the key unit of analysis by holiday, and in SFL that is the class. Just because in our Vietnamese language, I'm sorry, I'm from Vietnam, and my native language is Vietnamese, and our language identifies sentence as the unit for analyze and to build up the speech and so on. But with Holiday, he used the clause as the core unit. And I really want to explain it. I really want to hear why clause, but not sentence. And because I know some of you here are from Vietnam too. So in Vietnamese language, we translate the term clause by holiday into Vietnamese as somebody can translate it as Monday or cú. But how about some what might sound as the exact translation of this term into Vietnamese language? So I have two questions. The first one is for Professor Jonathan Webster about the reason why clause is considered as the core unit for analysis in SFL. And the second is about the proper way that we can translate clause into Vietnamese language. Thank you so much.
I can speak to your first point, probably not the last point, about the how to translate the word into Vietnamese. I think that should be answered by people that are familiar with Vietnamese, which I'm not. But come back to the point about Halliday's choice of the clause. First of all, beginning with the idea that there are ranks in looking at how the grammar is organized in a hierarchy. And along this rank scale, where Halliday observed there to be the choices that could be identified in terms of functional categories that related to choices of meaning that were then realized in the lexicogrammar, he found that the unit of the clause was the most basic lexicogrammatical unit. Now, what that would be, what that would correspond to, what would be the most basic lexicogrammatical unit, that would be something for someone who's working in their particular focus of language, which language they're focusing on, and identify based on what we've been talking about here, how are the choices in meaning realized lexicogrammatically? What would be the unit in terms of on this rank scale that one would observe? So you have morpheme, word, and so forth. For then in Vietnamese, what would be the ideal choice, and what would that be? Where would you locate yourself? So that's why the question is posed. For Halliday, identifying the clause and looking at then how meaning is realized in the clause, that sort of was the motivating way in which he approached language. Now, for someone who is working in another language, I'd ask you to consider, where are the choices in meaning? And I think we can agree that those metafunctions are, again, going to be in every language: the ideational, the interpersonal, the textual. How are they realized grammatically? How are they realized lexicogrammatically? And in what unit can you identify in that rank scale where those choices all sort of come together to create an act of meaning? All right? So again, you have to look at the language in which you are working and identify that unit that you feel would be considered that most basic lexicogrammatical unit. And then locate yourself there in order to look at how is the meaning realized in terms of the metafunctions. That would be, I can't speak to the particular language that you're mentioning But again, this would be the terms themselves. What would be a corresponding unit that you would identify? The idea of a most basic lexicogrammatical unit. The clause, yes, Halliday identifies. We see it in the examples we've given in English. But if you put it into another language, then what would be that unit? How is it lexicogrammatically realized? And that's what you need to be looking at. Is that clear?
Okay, I believe she is.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
please. Please go
So
on.
to my understanding, so the choice that we make in terms of meaning and would influence the way we choose what kind of linguistic unit to be the core thing to analyze, right?
I think you're correct, yeah.
Yeah. So lexicographer, lexicographer is just the way that we realize the meaning that we want to make in any particular situation of communication. Therefore, clause should be chosen as the unit, the core unit. So if we are talking about Vietnamese language, for example, so we have to realize, we have to identify what choice that we really want to make in this language in order to decide whether the sentence, the clause, or the phrase would be the unit for analyzing. Is that right?
I think so, yes.
Yes. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor, for your answers. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll have more constructive dialogues coming up in the coming dates. And we've got one more question from Thomas, who's on the way home, I believe. So Thomas said, thank you so much for a fascinating, comprehensive talk. When quoting Hassan's 1995 paper, which as I understand it, was a key point of separation between the theory of context advanced by Jim and that by Halliday and Hassan and others. Lately, these disagreements seem to be less salient, but bringing this up, could you go into more detail what you see that Martinian view of context, as is called, is missing? And yeah.
I won't respond on the part of about the Martinian view of context. I would go back to, because I raised this question with Halliday, what is the difference between register and genre? Because that seemed to be sort of the question that bugs everybody, you know. Are they the same and so forth? And I think it is relevant to this sort of I don't want to say disagreement, but a difference in perspective between what is considered the Hallidayan view and the Martinian view. Halliday responded by just simply saying, and I see it sort of as it's visually presented in the talk just now, that it's along this instantial scale. All right. And you have register and you have genre. These are varieties of language, but they are along this instantial scale. I mean, the way I see it is that register is something more concrete. It is less abstract than what we might consider in terms of genre and culture. Culture itself encompasses so much with respect to the resources of society, of a community. And so it's sometimes difficult to get away from Malinowski's encyclopedic approach, but it's necessary to do so. I agree with Firth on that point. And when we look at it then and distinguish what is culture, we can identify it and relate it to genre. Genre then being a bit more what I would consider more abstract along this instantial scale than register, which would be because we identify register with the concrete aspects of what is going on in the context of situation, field, tenor, mode. So in some respects, I see genre as in the example of the commencement speech. Okay, what is a commencement speech? Our culture sort of has a way of identifying what that should be like. But then in that particular context, in that situation, when the speech was being given, it was depicting a register, and in this case, I would call it an anti-register because it was going against everything that one would expect in that context of what you were saying, what you were talking about, and to whom you are talking. That's the contrast that I would see. So I come back to try to put it in more simple terms. Genre is more abstract, register is more concrete in terms of looking at it from the instantial scale.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan, for your response. So I hope that answers your questions, Thomas. And I think it's approaching 2 right now. So for some, it would be tea time. It would be dinner time. It would also be morning tea time. So I would pass the floor back to Vin, who is going to make a few announcements maybe. So once again, thank you so much, Professor Webster, for your very insightful, inspiring talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you so much, Jonathan, for your fantastic speech that wrapped up day 2 perfectly. So it was a wonderful day today. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining. And we had a very exciting program for day 3 with so many exciting speeches. The first one, plenary from Karen from Canada. That's the first plenary for the day. The second, at noon time, 1 p.m. keynote from Thomas in Japan and Michael from USA, and the final plenary for day 2 from Professor Christian Mathisen from Spain. And there are so many other fantastic talks from authors in Canada, Australia, Spain, China, Iran, India, Italy. So please don't miss out. We really look forward to seeing you again tomorrow for another wonderful day. So thank you so much again, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Stop the recording.